Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are working on this Champion 7500 watt generator. This one was dropped off by my friend Jason, who thankfully didn't pay anything for this machine. He sold a good generator to a guy, and when he dropped it off, the guy gave him this machine and another for free. So worst case, this is a good parts machine. Even if it runs and makes power, it still might be a parts machine because this frame is one of the worst that I've seen in quite a while. But yeah, is it going to run? I'm not sure, but I did pull the engine over, and surprisingly, the engine has very good compression, so it should be capable of running. Underneath all the dirt, I think we have a complete machine. All the parts seem to be here. The air cover is loose. Hopefully there is a filter under there. But the actual engine and the generator look to be pretty good. But there is signs of corrosion, on the end of the generator head. So I'm a little bit worried about that. Hopefully this thing makes power. The tank, it is actually pretty full of fuel. So I'm a little bit concerned about that. Thankfully, though, it is not leaking. And a nice feature this also has is electric start. Of course, the battery is stone cold dead, so yeah, no surprise there. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. Well, I was going to say first things first, let's check the oil. But yeah, I think we need to clean this off just a little bit before doing that. Ideally, I would pressure wash this machine before doing anything. But it's about 7 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Not the best idea for a pressure washer right now, but it might come to that anyway if this machine actually works. So what do you think? Are we going to have oil? And is it going to be clean? I would say yes, we have oil. But given the condition of the machine, I'd be surprised if anyone's changed it. And surprisingly, oil's full. And doesn't look terrible. Maybe a slight hint of fuel in there. But not too bad. I think we can at least test with it. Yeah, I'm noticing too, the fuel valve, it was left on. So that is not a good sign. And there is a ton of fuel in the tank. So let's drain the tank. Let's get it out of the way. Although I guess before we do any of that, let's take a look in there and see what we're dealing with. Yeah, a lot of junk under the cap, but it's all plastic, so that should clean up. Things don't look too bad up here, so there's a chance the tank might actually be good. Yeah, surprisingly, the inside of the tank is pretty clean. There is fuel in there. It looks old, but it does not smell expired. So, yeah, not too bad. The tank, believe it or not, I think is good. All right, so let's get the fuel line off. And actually, that clamp seems to be rusted away. We're missing half of it. So we will not reuse that. And the line actually feels pretty dry rot. So, yeah, we don't need to save that. But we do need to free it from the valve. Well, the fuel valve does not seem to be working, so let's try blowing some air through there backwards and see if we can't get some fuel to flow. Interesting. So we get flow of air. Maybe there's not as much fuel in there as I thought. So let me tilt the machine up a little bit so that any fuel that's in there comes to this side. Yeah, there we go. Well, it took a while, but we did get about 2 liters out of that tank. And as you can probably tell from looking at it, definitely not fresh, but there is no water in it. It doesn't smell bad, so this can be cleaned up and mixed with good fuel, which is what I plan to do. And we'll get the tank vent off. Looks to be cracked right there, so, oh yeah, not in very good shape. Yeah, in most cases, all you need to do is remove those 4 bolts, disconnect the lines, and the tank will lift right off. But the design of this one is such that you can't do that. But the side rail here, it is removable. Just 2 bolts, then the tank should come right out. Yeah, things aren't looking a whole lot better now that we have the tank off. We can see that the starter, pretty rusted. Hopefully that still works. The adjustment for the governor, it is rusted in place. Throttle plate, surprisingly not stuck, although the carburetor, at least on the outside, looking pretty bad. The breather, I believe it's been chewed away. And there's like a protective sleeve going over the ignition wire, which also looks to be falling apart. So yeah, this machine is pretty rough. Let's get a look under the cover here. And thankfully we do have a filter. So that is a good sign. It's pretty clean behind there. So I'm going to leave that in for now. But let's check for spark. Actually, let's get this bad battery out and put something in its place. We'll test electric start and spark at the same time. Nope. I think this bolt is pretty rusted on. The outside's also, well, not really in a good hex shape anymore either, so I can't seem to find a socket that'll hold it. Let's try a little more pressure. Hey, broke it off. That works too. And for now, I'm not going to commit by installing a battery. There's a lot of unknowns on this machine, so I'm going to just temporarily attach a battery. And this way too, if something goes wrong, we can always disconnect this pretty quick. And let's see if we get any starter action here. Oh, I was about to say no. We definitely have issues either with the switch or the solenoid, but if you push it just right. I was going to say the engine cranks, but that might have been it as far as the electric start goes. So, yeah, we could fix this. We very well will fix it. But for now, we'll use it as is and circle back if everything else checks out. Just blow that out a bit. I see some junk down there. And there is some rust on the plug. So pretty much on par for the rest of the machine. The plug, though, surprisingly not tight. And yeah, it's spinning out without issue. Yeah, plug looks decent. You know, it was running pretty well at one point and no rust, which is the important factor here. So despite the way it looks on the outside, the inside seems to be decent. So let's check for spark. So let me kill the lights, get in real close, and we'll try the electric start. So we'll shut the lights off. Keep an eye on the tip of the plug. I'm going to crank the engine, hopefully with the electric start. Okay, we've got a good spark. So a machine like this, it does have a compression release. You know, ideally we'd see 60 psi, but that's usually plus or minus about 10. So anywhere between 50 and 70 psi would be perfect. So let's see where this one comes in at. Perfect. And we are at about 60 psi. So the compression does check out. When I take a quick peek at the valves, this machine's clearly had a tough life. So I'm thinking the valves have likely never been checked. And this is also going to give us a good idea of the runtime or how well it was maintained. If there's a lot of sludge and dark looking oil on the top here, then we know it's been abused both inside and out. But if it's clean, then maybe it was not used a whole lot and just left outside to rot. Now, there is a meter on the other side too, which I think will show us total runtime on the engine, you know, once we get this running. And yeah, look at that. That is spotless inside there. Looks like the gasket's a little bit messed up, so we'll get a new one of those on. There is clearance on the exhaust. So the intake's open right now, so we can check the exhaust. Although, one thing I'm noticing is that, you know, the flat spot here on the spring keeper, it's off to the left. This one's kind of at the 11 o'clock position, and those ideally should be facing down. You know, because what's going to happen is that the rocker needs a little bit more clearance. If it doesn't have that clearance where the flat spot is, then the side of the rocker arm starts pushing on the retainer and eventually will cause them to fail. So let's try to straighten those up first. Then we'll check the clearance. All right, that one's pretty good. We can't do the intake yet because there's pressure on that valve. So we'll set the clearance here, and then we'll check the intake. And we'll start with the 8 thousandths feeler gauge. That's what the exhaust clearance should be, plus or minus 1/1000th. And it's close, but it's not an 8, so I'm thinking it's going to be a 7. And the 7 does not fit either. So actually, we might be a little bit out of spec. Let's try a 5. Yeah, 5 fits pretty well. Yeah, and a 6 does not fit. So it seems like we might be a little bit on the tight side on the exhaust. So I'm not going to adjust it yet. I'm going to double check the specs for this exact engine. But usually 6 and 8 on this type of design. So let's rotate the engine manually until the exhaust is open, and we'll double check the intake. And for the intake, it should be 6 thousandths plus or minus 1/1000th. So we'll check on the tight side of the spec, which would be a 5 thousandths feeler gauge. And it fits, but definitely tight. So technically the intake I think is fine. We're just on the tight side of the spec. So I'm going to pause it a second. I just want to double check the exact clearances that Champion calls out and make that adjustment, although I guess we can make this one first and just rotate that flat spot down like we did on the other valve. Like that. All right, I was able to find the specs on this engine, and it's what I thought. The intake should be 6 thousandths, the exhaust 8, plus or minus 1/1000th. So we're actually okay on the intake at 5 thousandths. The exhaust, though, we do need to open up to about 8 thousandths. So we'll get this adjuster cracked loose. And I do like this design quite a bit, you know, as far as how the rockers are held in place. Hondas and most Honda clones, you know, the design isn't as good, and it actually relies on the pushrod guide to hold the rockers in place. But in this case, we actually have a rocker bridge that takes that function. So definitely a big improvement. Now, that adjuster was actually pretty loose. Usually they take a lot more force. I found a date code on this machine. It's from 2011. So, you know, when they sit for that long, the nut usually doesn't want to break free without an impact. So potentially someone's already been in here. All right, that feels pretty good. And it tightened up. So sometimes that screw can move, you know, when you tighten the bolt or the nut. But a lot of times, even if it stays still, you're going to have a different clearance because it takes away the slop in the threads between the nut and the adjuster screw. So you definitely have to double check it after you tighten it. And that actually feels pretty good. I think we're right on. Nope, actually maybe a bit loose. Let's try a 9. Yeah, actually, it is a bit loose. Yeah, the 8 feels pretty good. We've got some drag. Let's see what a 9 feels like. And a 9 does not fit. So good. Exhaust valve is set. Let's just make sure that is snug. We'll double check the intake. Yep, they're both good. So this gasket definitely got crushed in a few spots. You know, it was not installed properly. So to avoid that, you want to take the new gasket and put it on the cover side first. And you just don't hold it here and smush it down. There's actually this edge all the way around that this will fit perfectly over. And once it's fully in place here on the cover, you know, it just drops right on. You can bolt it down, and it's not going to cause any damage to the gasket. Like that. And we'll get a new plug-in, NGK. BPR 6ES should be gapped to 30, which that one is. And actually, let's put a little fuel in there. Let's start this for a second, see if the engine runs and if the generator makes power before cleaning up what is probably going to be a mess inside that carb. All right, so will it run and make power? The answer is yes to running, at least for a second, you know, based on the testing. You know, I think the engine's fine. The generator, not sure about. So we do have a light plugged in and turned on. Now, the engine's gonna only run for a second. It may not be enough to get that light to do anything, but hopefully we see a little glimmer of hope there. Let's try it. This one definitely caught me by surprise. It ran on its own with whatever junky fuel was in that carburetor. So I did not expect that at all, but we got some good information out of it. I mean, the engine's good. Apparently the carburetor's good. The generator's good. And the output, according to the kilowatt, was pretty much perfect. And the hour counter, Not too bad either. Only 169 hours. So the big question is, what do we do with this? I mean, it obviously needs to be cleaned up. We need to do a few fixes here and there. The electric start actually was working better. Maybe not. But, you know, this has issues. And it is absolutely frigid out this time of year. You know, trying to paint that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So there is another option. I'm not sure if I like the option or not, but I do have another frame which is absolutely spotless. It's not a champion frame, but it is a pretty big upgrade to this. So yeah, let me grab the frame and we'll make a decision on how we want to proceed. Okay, and the thing we're after is, of course, in the back corner. It is right there. So, yeah, let me spend a little bit of time. We'll get that out and back to the shop. Yeah, I think this is going to work out perfect. I just measured the distance between these two frame rails. Did the same on the Champion, and they look to be identical. So that means we only need to unbolt the mounts, lift everything off, drop it in place, and bolt it down without any modification. So that part of the swap is going to be pretty easy. Really, the only other thing worthy of note here is that we are going to lose the 12-volt charging, most likely. And this was originally a 7,000 watt machine, whereas the Champion was rated at 7,500 watts. So we actually have 30 amp breakers on this machine and 28 amp breakers on this machine. So we're going to lose a little bit on the top end. You know, technically we could swap these breakers out, but I don't think I'm going to do that. You know, I'd rather underrun a machine just a bit than pushing it right to the edge. Now, as good as this frame looks, it is not complete. You know, I do not have the original tank, don't have the original wheel kit. You know, those were used for other projects, but I do now have some stuff that I think will work with this, starting with the tank. This is a Honda clone tank that I bought for another project. They do come in different sizes. This one, I believe, is the right size to just drop in and be bolted down. So hopefully that's the case. If not, there might be a few other options. You know, as far as the wheel kit goes, a friend actually gave me a wheel kit last summer, and it's brand new in the box. So we can get that installed and get mobility out of that frame. And I grabbed a few other things as well, not because we need them, but because these are a lot cleaner than what's on the machine right now. Plus, the Champion Yellow on the blower housing, it's not going to work too well, so I scrounged up an OEM Predator blower housing. So we'll swap that out with the yellow Champion one. So let's start actually with the wheel kit. You know, I'm going to leave the handle off for now until we do the engine swap. Now look at that, we got two handles, so we got a choice. But these are the wheels that we're after. And technically, well, I have other wheels, so, you know, this kit, the picture on the front was for a smaller machine. It says 3,500 watts, but it does say it fits machines up to 9,000, so this kit should be compatible. And it looks like we have all the parts, so let's start with the wheels. Let's see if the tank is going to fit. Yeah, that is going to work out perfect. So no issues with the wheel kit. Tank, also a good match, both in color and in fit. You know, the bolt holes align pretty much perfectly. So let's turn our attention back to the Champion. It's not quite as simple as I made it sound earlier. I mean, we do need to pull the 4 mounting bolts, and it should lift out. But we're still tethered in place by a few things. We have the wiring on the high voltage side of things connected to the control panel. All those wires need to be disconnected. We also have an engine wire harness back here, which is a little bit harder to see, but all that stuff has to be unplugged as well. I'm going to remove the airbox because when we set the engine down, it's actually probably going to cause damage. This extends below the bottom of the engine, so we'll pull that. Likely pull the exhaust and the charcoal canister. Those things are just going to get in the way. So let's start with maybe the exhaust. Let's see if those bolts will come out, and we'll just work our way around. Yeah, these nuts, they look a little bit unhappy. So I'm going to actually use the Dremel, just clean off some of the scale, you know, as best I can. It's a little tight back here. We'll try some penetrating oil, and hopefully those break free without too much of a fight. Oh, that one's not budging. Let's try the back one. Okay, that one's turning. Nope. Let's try turning it the other way. And then back to loosen. Oh, there we go. Nice. And we've got 2 more right here, and the exhaust should be free. And this charcoal canister, I don't think we can remove quite yet. There's 2 bolts right there, and you need to come in at it kind of from the airbox side. So we'll get that out of the way first. But this is something we're not going to need on the Predator frame because that has a vented fuel cap. So this part can be deleted. The airbox, surprisingly clean inside. So definitely a good sign. You know, between that and what we saw up in the valve cover. Again, I think the inside of this engine is great. Huh. We just got to fix the outside. And now for the engine harness. So some of these wires will be easy to identify. This one goes over to the ignition coil, so that's to kill spark. And that one doesn't want to release. Yeah, there are some green crusties in there, so I might have to use excessive force here to get this separated at the risk of damaging something. Okay, that side looks good. It's actually the Champion control panel side that doesn't look so great. Then we have the fuel solenoid for the carburetor. So the other machine may not be able to power that. So 3 disconnected, and we have a few left. So this brown wire goes behind the flywheel. So that's actually the power, likely for charging the battery, which I think the Predator can do. And then we have a yellow wire, which is low oil sensor, or the low oil module. And then a couple other wires. So this is likely for the electric start. At least one of them is the trigger wire. The other one, I'm not quite sure. Let's see where these go. And I think this is the best view we're going to get. So this wire right here, I believe is the trigger wire for the starter. And then we have a white wire, which runs to battery positive. So that is the charge wire. And it's so tight in here, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to get that off, but we do need to remove this bolt under the cover. With the trigger wire, we have a quick connect so we can get that unplugged. Maybe. It surprisingly opened up easy. A little bit of trash in there. A little bit of corrosion. Not liking that wire block. There's a lot of rust on there, so we're probably going to replace that. We have a few zip ties here we need to cut. So let's do that. I'm going to get... Technically, we could leave the AVR here, but I think this is a little bit proprietary to the Champion, so I do want to flip it over and at least take a look. But the important thing we need to do here, at least for now, is disconnect the wires that run up to the control panel. Yeah, actually, this is a standard AVR. There are some models that have an extra wire, and this does not have it. It just has the standard output to the brushes, the input from the stator. So we can keep this AVR. And I guess next we'll get these wires removed. Now, it's really important to note which wires are neutral and which wires are the live wires, and sometimes it's not that obvious. But in this case, I think it is. They're actually using the correct colors here. A lot of machines don't do that. So black and red, those are the two live wires, and the neutral is the white. And kind of the dead giveaway, besides the colors, is that this terminal has two wires on it. So they're commoning up the neutrals on leg 1 and leg 2. So if the colors were meaningless, that right there is a pretty big clue. All right, let's see if these are going to play nice. Yep. And on this machine, it does not look like there was a bond between ground and neutral, so likely it is a floating neutral, although the bond could be in the control panel. So let's just double check that real quick. The Predator, it is actually labeled as a floating neutral. So technically, I guess we don't need to double check if this was floating or not. And we do have an auxiliary winding here, so that would have been for battery charging, which the Predator has. I'm not sure if the winding in this stator is compatible, but we will give it a try. I think while we're here, let's just get a better wire block in place. Now, just making sure these are actually colored the same. We got black and red. These wires look black, but they are neutral. And we actually have a blue, two blues. So we want to make sure we keep those together. Yeah, we also have some issues here with the insulation coming too far down. So that needs to be trimmed back. Probably same thing on the neutral. That wire looks good. Yeah, we're getting pretty close here. So technically we can pull the engine mounts and pull this out. There shouldn't be anything holding it on except maybe this little tether right here. So we'll get that removed. The thing I'm a little more concerned about though is the control panel. It's going to restrict kind of what we're trying to do here. So I'm actually going to pull this off, do the same to the Predator. Then I think we'll be ready. Yeah, I think we just ran into our first problem here. So I was hoping to swap this tin out with one that's cleaner, and I just realized this entire piece, it is proprietary. I haven't seen one like it before, and we can't take this off and replace it. We have to keep this here, and it's kind of going to snowball because the piece where it meets the blower housing, this corner is also proprietary. So the Predator blower housing also not going to work, which means we're going to have to clean this up, which I think it will clean up actually pretty well. But yellow, not a good color to go on a Predator. So we are likely going to have to get a bit of paint on that. Oh yeah, nice mouse house in there. Hopefully he's gone. And we got a chewed wire here on the kill wire. So, I mean, the coil obviously still works, but yeah, it's got some issues, and I'm pretty sure I have ones that are better. So let's swap that out. So fish this wire up through the casting here. There's a little hole for it. And under the governor arm. And we're gonna have to gap this. I think for now we'll just pull it all the way back, and then we'll get a business card and set the gap to about 10 thousandths of an inch. So just rotate it so that the magnet is right centered under that coil, and use a business card to set the gap. So with that in place, you can just loosen up those bolts, and the magnet most of the times will actually pull the coil in. So it's in the exact position it needs to be right now. So we'll just snug these back up, remove the card, and then just rotate the flywheel. Make sure that the ignition coil doesn't scrape anywhere. And that is perfect. So we'll get the wire re-secured. And there's still a little bit of material in here, so I'm just gonna blow that out before we move on. Actually, let's clean this stuff up while we have access to it. I've got everything all strapped up again, so let's hoist it up and see if we can fit it into the Predator frame. Yeah, pretty good fit. Just dropped right in place, bolted down. It's kind of like it was meant to be. So now that it's in here, I guess there is one other issue we need to deal with, and that is the exhaust. The Predator used a different type of exhaust. It had mounting locations for the heat shields pretty much all over the place. And for the most part, I don't think they're going to interfere, except for this one. That one is in the way, and with that in place, we can't actually put the exhaust on. So we do need to cut that off. All right, let's see if it's going to fit or if we need to modify it anymore. Yeah, the frame actually might be in the way. Although if I can get it on the studs, I think that'll clear. There we go. Just fit. Definitely tight getting it in there, but we do have enough clearance. I don't think that's going to be banging when the engine's running. So the exhaust, I would say, is done. The blower housing we're going to come back to. I'm going to paint that up, and while that's drying, we'll clean up the carb. I think for now we do need to get the control panel back on, complete all the wiring, and then we can finish it up. All right, so we need to double check the wires here on the Predator control panel. You know, we tested the wires on the engine and the generator. We have a good handle on what those are. These, you know, may not correspond exactly, so we need to know for sure what they are before we try to wire anything in. So we're going to start here on the high voltage side of things. We have these two connectors right here, which are auxiliary windings that come out of the stator. Now, the Champion only has one auxiliary winding, and this one right here we cannot use because we don't have a connector for it on the Champion stator, but this is what powers the 12 volts out on the front. So we're not going to have that, which is fine. But the other connector, that is an auxiliary winding for the fuel solenoid. So this control panel can power that. But let's just double check. It should be AC coming from the stator, and then it gets rectified to DC. So I'm going to set this to test diodes. And we'll set that right there. Hopefully you can see it. And these connectors here, the male one should be negative, female should be positive. So if we connect the positive probe lead to either one of these terminals, we should get positive only on the positive output. And that'll be indicated by a voltage drop on the multimeter. Yep, voltage drop. Check the other terminal, voltage drop. And then if we do the same over here, we get no voltage drop because that is the negative. But if we reverse the leads, then we should now get a voltage drop on the negative output, which is that one, but not on the positive. So good. We know what that is. That should work. We also have the high voltage output wires. So luckily, these colors do make sense. The red and the black should be leg 1 and leg 2. The whites will be neutral. You know, on the Champion control panel, we had one white, but in this case, we have two. So we'll have to double those up. And then we have a wire with a green stripe, so that is likely ground. So let's double check that. I'm going to set this to continuity. And when we have a connection, we'll get a beep. So if I flip this over, and I'm going to use the 240 to do the testing. So we'll just test the ground first, which is the one here with the prong. And yeah, that's kind of loosely in there, but hopefully good enough. And then if we test down here on what I think is the ground wire, we should get a beep. And we do. Now, if this is a bonded generator, meaning the neutral and the grounds are connected, we're also going to get continuity on these white wires. So let's check that. Okay. So I thought this was a floating setup, but it's not. So all three wires here are essentially the same thing. So if I move this probe over to neutral, we're going to get the same thing down here. Continuity on all three. So that's important to know. You know, if you get these wires mixed up and you accidentally connect, you know, a hot wire to a neutral, bad things are going to happen. So we're just left now with the red and the black. So the legs are opposite, not opposite, next to the ground. And that should be either the red or the black wire. So let's check the red. Nothing there. and it's the black wire. So if we check the one opposite, that should be the red. Unless I got it backwards. Nope. There we go. Okay, so we know what all these wires are. So we can now focus more on the engine control side of things. So I think we can just flip this over for most of this. And we'll focus in on these wires right here. So we have a brown wire. That should be the AC output from the stator behind the flywheel. And that gets rectified. I believe it's just a single diode. And the output will go to the battery through this wire. So again, we can test this in diode mode. We'll set this to that mode right there. And I'm not sure why it's fluctuating. Let's try. Yeah, that's what it should be. 1.4. And this should be positive coming out. So if we do positive on the brown, that should be passed through to this wire, and we should see a voltage drop, which we do. And if you do the opposite, no voltage drop. So good. We know what those wires are. We know what the green wires are. And that just leaves these right here. So the starter solenoid actually is powered by this connector. So we got kind of lucky. The Champion didn't have a connector. It was just a ring terminal. And actually the starter we put on there has the same connector. So it must have been a Predator starter. So if we wanted to test this, we could. I don't think we need to, but if we go back to continuity, we'd have to put basically one lead on each terminal, which isn't that hard, but the hard part is I then have to reach around and hit the start button, and I don't have enough arms to do that. So we're going to assume that's good, and that leaves us with these three wires right here. So this one's interesting. We have a red wire, and that actually is the low oil light. So the low oil light on the front of the machine is right here. And you need a special oil module for that, which I think I have. So we could probably test that because the light also needs a ground, which is going to be one of these. And the wire that's black, I'm willing to bet, is the kill wire to shut the engine down. So right now the engine is in the off position, or I should say the switch. And if we connect the other lead over here to ground, we should get a beep, which we do. So if we turn the switch to run and do the same test from ground to the black wire, we should not get a beep. And we don't. So we know what the black wire is. So I believe the other wire, the black wire with the white stripe, that's going to be the other part of the light circuit. And I believe that is also a LED, which is a diode. So we're going to put this back into the diode mode. And I'm not sure which way is which, so we'll just try both. Let's see if we get a voltage drop from the black wire with the white stripe to the red, and we do not. So let's reverse this. Yeah, actually that's probably the ground. Red would make sense to be the power. And we don't have anything there either. So yeah, I guess I'm not sure what that wire is. But I'm fairly certain it needs to be wired into the ignition circuit. But Yeah, let me poke around here a little bit and just see if I can prove out what this last wire is. All right, we're going in. I am not sure what that black wire is with the white stripe. So probably the easiest way is to look. Okay, so the light has a green and red wire. The red wire is connected, it looks like, to this right here, so it's red to red. And the green wire comes over to here. I don't know if you can see that. And on the other side of that connector, we have a black wire with a white stripe. So, yeah, it is for the light. So it's interesting that I can't seem to test it. So I'm not sure what type of light this is, but I think my earlier assumption that it was an LED or incandescent was wrong. This could be something else altogether, or maybe the light just doesn't work. But yeah, it is what I thought it was, so let's get this back together. All right, so things are pretty tight in here, but let's get this stuff connected up. Hopefully you can see it okay. This wire coming out, this is the one from behind the stator. That's the charge wire for the battery, so that goes to the brown. And for the battery to charge, we need to connect the white wire to the battery. So the way that is done is actually through the post on the solenoid. So we'll put that wire there, as well as battery positive, which connects directly to the battery. All right, that looks good. So we'll just get the cover on to help protect this from shorting out. Because this is positive all the time. Okay, so the battery charging's all set. Oil module we'll circle back to in a second. The fuel solenoid we don't need to worry about yet. And actually that's related as well to the low oil module. So let's get that connected next. And then we can plug in a bunch of these wires. So we're going to use this location right here, which is usually where you find the low oil module. In this case, they also put the battery negative in this spot. I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, but I don't think it's going to cause any issues doing that. Okay. And on normal low oil modules, you only have two wires, the yellow and the black. So the yellow wire connects to the low oil switch, which is inside the engine. And the black is what's used to ground out the coil. So this is the wire right here going to the coil. And it looks like we have a little problem with the insulation, so let's get a little shrink tubing on there so we don't accidentally shut the engine down if that touches something. All right, we'll shrink that down at the end. And that leaves us with a few more wires. So the black wire, that's connected to the switch up above to shut the engine down. So we will put that in circuit. Like that. And this is the wire that is for the light. Low oil alert light. And the red wire also, that's the extra wire coming out of the oil module. Also runs to the light. And this is for the starter solenoid, which connects in right here. And that should do it. You know, we'll connect those up when we get the carb back on. So let me tidy this up a bit, and then we can move on. All right, so let's get this wired up, starting with the red. So that'll be leg 1. And I'm just going to leave these a little bit loose for right now. We need to get, you know, the wires situated, all the wires situated before we tighten anything up. Yeah, and I can tell you right now, this is going to be a problem trying to get all these wires on one terminal. So we might use all 4 here. Since we have 4 wires coming out, we can probably get away with that as long as it reaches, which it looks like it does. So we'll split up the neutrals, but then we'll have to combine them with a jumper. Although technically this is combining them, right? Because they're tied together in the control panel. So this actually should be okay. So I think the paint's going to set up well. I actually just brought it inside to dry because it is way too cold out here for that paint to set properly. So while we're waiting for that, I think we should tackle this carburetor. So we'll get the fuel line off. And we know the carb, as bad as it looks on the outside, can't be that bad inside. It actually seemed to run halfway decent on that old gas. So actually, let's drain the carb. It looks like we do still have some fuel in there. Yeah, and debris. Maybe a bit of water too. So, yeah, it's a good thing we're going in here. The carb likely would not have run for much longer. Let's see if these crusty screws will come out. Fuel solenoid looks to be in good shape. It's actually pretty clean and moves freely, so that is a good sign. Let's see if we can get this bolt off here for the bowl. Pretty clean, actually. Okay, there is some debris in there. I don't think it's corrosion. That's actually going to clean up really well. Float looks good. Pin is free. Needle looks good. That is part of the fuel solenoid, so it might still work, but this boot is falling apart. So I'll check if I have another one in better shape. If I do, we'll end up using that. So down the center here is the main jet, which is coming out, as well as the emulsion tube. Yeah, pretty clean. Main jet, it is clear. And then we have the pilot right here. So we need to remove the idle set screw. As well as the spacer. And actually, before I pull this out, let's just spray the top down here with some carb cleaner. It's a pretty small passage under here, and dirt like this could easily clog that up. All right, that's pretty much it. So the carb actually is in pretty good shape, aside from all the dirt on the outside. So I'm just going to run through some of these passages, make sure they're clear. We'll give it like a 10-minute soak in the ultrasonic. Then I think we'll be good to go. All right, so the carb is done, cleaned up pretty well, at least all the dirt's off it. Now there is some corrosion, both inside the bowl and on the carb body, so it's kind of on par with the rest of the machine. That shouldn't impact the way it runs. So let's get it back together. Now, I am going to substitute a few parts. As mentioned earlier, this boot kind of falling apart. So I do have a parts carb that actually is brand new. It just never ran right. So I stole pretty much all the parts from the bowl down, including the fuel solenoid, some of the screws and hardware. So we're going to use all of this stuff instead of this stuff. It'll still work, but it's corroded and kind of not the best choice when we have something much better we could use. So let's get it back together, starting with the emulsion tube and the main jet. And it's not uncommon either for a carb to flood over after you put it back together. Sometimes the needle isn't quite centered right. So by flipping the float a few times, that kind of helps center it. And I would say lowers the chance of it flooding over the first time you try to use it. So we actually need the bowl gasket as well from the new but bad carburetor. So we'll get that fitted. Although this one, yeah, it's a little bit damaged, I think, right? I was going to say right there, it looked like it was twisted. But maybe not. Maybe that was just a manufacturing defect. So we'll give this one a try. And if it doesn't work out, we can always go back to the original. And then the solenoid itself. So the wire needs to be pointing or exiting the same way as the fuel inlet. And last but not least, we get the pilot back in. Make sure it's fully seated, like that. Need the spacer and the idle set screw to hold it all together. This machine does not idle, so you don't need to drive this in too far. Just enough to hold this in place, and one or two threads to poke through on the other side. Like that. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to give the paint a little bit more time to dry, and then we'll finish this up. So the paint is pretty dry at this point, so I think we can get this stuff back together. Now, this harness right here, this is the 12-volt output, which we don't need. So I'm just going to zip tie it out of the way, And the plan originally was to hold it right there with a bolt. But that is not drilled out. So instead, we're going to use the bolt over here that holds the AVR in. We'll just double up, although I think I'm going to need a little bit longer bolt just to make sure we have enough thread engagement. Okay, that should be good. And up here, there was just a zip tie right like that, holding these bundles together. So I'm going to do the same thing, and then we'll try fitting the cover. All right, so let's get this breather swapped out. It's a fairly universal part, so I'm going to use this Generac breather. It's the exact same thing, except not all chewed up by a mouse. And we don't need it. The old Airbox wasn't terrible, but we do have a brand new one. And these are fairly cheap. They're only about $18. Now, actually, I'm noticing studs are a little bit short, so it's expecting the metal Airbox, which is a lot thinner. So I think we have no choice but to go back to the original in this case. All right, so we can get the original Airbox back on. And it was not in bad shape. But I do kind of like the other style a little bit better because, you know, this airbox, it's actually a split design, and there's a seal in the middle in between the two halves. So, you know, as these airboxes age, that seal deteriorates and it can be less effective, meaning, you know, some of the air might bypass the filter and instead kind of come in through the sides. And last but not least, we got the battery. So I believe this is the size that would have been in here originally. Unfortunately, I don't have the tie down for it. So probably going to have to use a strap of the right size to hold it down. The only issue is I think it is going to kind of work its way out, maybe closer to the edge. So I might add a second strap going around the bottom, holding it to that back plate. So yeah, hopefully that works. If not, we can come up with another plan. But let's get the battery connected and then we'll try to secure it. Yeah, that's not going anywhere. So now that we have everything back together, we need to try this out again. The carb was running the engine well before we rebuilt it, so hopefully it still does. Of course, we've had everything electrical apart and back together again into a different wire harness. So there's always a risk that something was wired wrong. So I'm going to start it. Hopefully that light turns on, the carb runs it well. And I'm also looking to see if the battery is charging. We're actually starting off at about 13.18 volts. So let's get the engine started and try it out. All right, choke is on. All right, that was pretty much perfect. The engine started up right away. I could turn the choke off. The light came on as well. So the engine speed, the frequency are more or less perfect, and the battery is charging. So I would say that this thing is ready to go. With the big exception, we haven't actually changed the oil yet. So let's do that now real quick, and then we'll get this outside for a load test. Wow, I've got a breaker bar, and that thing is not breaking free. There we go. Yeah, I'm noticing. Looks like we do have a little leak right there. So that's probably how this side of the engine got coated in oil. There's supposed to be an O-ring here, so let's see if that O-ring is still present. Yeah, it's still there, although it might be a bit deformed. Yeah, the O-ring actually doesn't look that bad. In a few places it looks a little wavy, so that might be the issue. Anyway, I don't have an extra cap at the moment, but I'm going to order one. So for now, we're going to run what we have. The oil that came out, it is pretty thin. I just double checked it. It does not smell contaminated with fuel, so potentially someone put the wrong grade oil in here. But the good news is there is no metallic, no shiny bits. So I would say the engine is in good health. Well, I did manage to scrounge up another cap. I think the big question is it the same thread? They do vary a little bit. And it's a different thread, so yeah, not a big deal. Anyway, I'm going to test it as is. I wouldn't say the weather's great outside, but it's probably the nicest day I'm going to get in the next week or so. And as you can probably tell, it's a little bit cold out, a little bit windy, very bright with all this white snow, so I can't imagine the camera's picking up something dark very well. But it is nice enough to do a test. At least the sun's out. So, this machine originally was rated at 7,500 watts. I have no doubt it's going to get to 7,000 without issue. What I'm a little more concerned about actually is the battery charging. The last time we had this running, we saw that it was charging the battery, but that voltage was ramping up pretty quickly. And ideally, we will not exceed 14.7 volts. Otherwise, you start causing damage to the battery. But I think we're going to see closer to 16. A lot of people complain that Honda clones, they'll charge the battery at about 16 volts, which isn't great. It's going to shorten the life of the battery. I'm hoping it stops before it gets to 16. If it passes it, then maybe we have a problem here. So the plan is to get the engine started. While it's warming up, we'll double check the output using the kilowatt to measure the frequency in the hertz. We'll use the amp probe to measure the total harmonic distortion and the oscilloscope to see what the sine wave looks like. We'll then put on a half load of 3,500 watts. We'll give that some time, and if everything goes well, then we'll bring it up to the max of 7,000 watts. All right, no issues at all getting the machine started. It's been running for a couple minutes, but the battery voltage, not too happy about it. We're approaching 16 volts, and I think we're gonna pass it in a minute. So I'm actually gonna shut it down. I'm gonna disconnect the charging system, and I think this machine's gonna need a trickle charger. And the wire he wants, the brown wire, that's the one that comes from the stator. This charger, there's no regulator on it. So it is just purely the output from the charge coil, rectified, and sent to the battery. So, potentially this could be upgraded, but the way that it is right now, it's no good. Alright, so now that the charging is disabled, the voltage is still high, but we're not increasing, so we're not going to cook that battery. Without a load, THD is starting off at about 5.9%, and sine wave is fairly typical. It's jagged, but that should clean up. So let's put on maybe a 3,000 watt load to start. We'll start with 2,000 watts. No issues. We'll add another 1,000. Alright, we're at 3,000 watts. Everything's running nice and steady. THD jumped quite a bit. We're now at 21.2%. And it looks like the sine wave smoothed out, but the voltage may have come up a bit as well. So let's give this a few minutes. If everything checks out, we'll go for the max, the 7,000 watts. Alright, it's been a few minutes, no issues at all, pulling 3,000 watts. The voltage actually is still pretty good, about 121 volts. So let's bring the load up. Right now we're at 3,000 watts. Let's bring it to 4,000, 5,000, 5,500, 6,000. So it looks like it's holding at 59 Hertz, which is good. So let's swap this. We're back to 6,000 watts, 6,500, 7,000. And it's working. It's working hard. It's right at the edge, actually. I'm not sure I trust leaving it like that, so I'm going to back it off just a little bit. So we're at 6,500 watts. THD is at 24.6, and the sine wave looks largely unchanged. Alright, no issues maintaining 6,500 watts. So let's try 7,000 again. Yeah, it's doing it. Let's try more than 7,000. So we're back to 7,000. Let's try 7,500. Yep. How about 8,000? Yeah, it's out of power at 8,000. But that's okay. This machine's only rated at 7, so let's take the load off. We'll let things cool down, and then we'll shut it down. Alright guys, and that is pretty much a wrap. You know, this machine had no issues pulling its rated load of 7,000 watts. Really the only issue we encountered was the charging system. So right now it is bypassed. There are things we can do to improve on that, but to be honest, most of the time the machine's not running. So, you know, spending time and money fixing the charging system on the engine probably isn't the best idea. A lot of machines in this size, they don't actually charge their own battery. They come with a battery maintainer. So when you park this in the corner of your garage, you just plug it into the wall, battery's maintained, and it's ready to go when and if the power goes out. So, I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.